Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time, we're going to be cracking open a historical time capsule, so to speak. It's Roberto de Mattei's book, The Second Vatican Council, an unwritten story. We're going to zero in on, what happened after Vatican II. It's a time just bursting with big ideas, really strong personalities, and maybe even some theological turbulence.
Yeah, it's like we're looking at the aftershocks of a major earthquake, not just the initial tremor. Like, how did people actually respond to the changes? Did it lead to a real renewal like they hoped, or did things maybe go a bit sideways? That's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Okay, right from the start, de Mattei uses this really intense image. It's one that both Pope Benedict XVI and St. Basil the Great, way back, have used. They compare the Church after Vatican II, and get this, also after the Council of Nicaea centuries earlier, to like a chaotic naval battle at night, ships colliding in a huge storm. What's with this dramatic imagery, do you think?
I think it really highlights that sense of disorientation and conflict that followed the council. It wasn't just about updating a few practices. It triggered fundamental debates about what the church, even ILS, its role in the modern world, and even how to interpret its own teachings. Theologians have a fancy word for this: hermeneutics.
Hermeneutics, huh? I'm all for expanding my vocabulary, but
Yeah.
break that down for me and the folks at home. What exactly does that mean?
Sure. Think of it like this. You've got this ancient, complex text, the teachings of the church, right? Hermeneutics is all about the lens you use to interpret that text. And depending on the lens, you get a different understanding. And sometimes those understandings clash.
So it's not just what the church teaches, but how we understand it in today's world.
Exactly. And the book makes this point. A new theology was already brewing before Vatican II even started. This new theology was challenging the traditional scholastic approach. De Mattei cites Pius XII's encyclical, Humani Generis, where Pius condemned stuff like relativism and novelties in theology. It's like the seeds of change, or maybe even dissent, were already planted.
So we have this, backdrop of brewing theological change. Then comes Pope John the 23rd, the one who actually called for the council.
Yeah.
Was he a reformer at heart, or was he more of a traditionalist? De Mattei seems to think that even John the 23rd himself was surprised by how quickly things moved once he called for the council.
John the 23rd is such a fascinating figure. You're right, the book suggests he was a little taken aback by the momentum he unleashed. I mean, on the one hand, he was super devout, wanted to bring new life to the church. But on the other hand, and this is where it gets interesting, the book mentions his early connections to modernism.
Hold on, modernism. Wasn't that condemned by the church? How does that fit into the picture?
It's a real puzzle, isn't it? It makes you wonder about, what really shaped his thinking. Did he call for the council to embrace those modernist tendencies or to, counter them? People are still debating that today.
And get this, the book also says that some very conservative cardinals like Ottaviani and Ruffini, they wanted a council too, but for totally different reasons. They hoped it would solidify traditional teachings and maybe even officially condemn modernism.
That's right. They saw it as a chance to, reinforce the traditional defenses. So you can see how this clash of visions, like renewal versus reinforcement, was bound to lead to some drama.
It's almost like you had these two powerful currents colliding at the council, each with their own goals and their own theological basis. Talk about a recipe for some epic theological showdowns.
Absolutely. And to make things even more complicated, Vatican II saw a big shift in power dynamics within the church. You have the rise of national bishops' conferences, especially in Central Europe. They started to emerge as a counterbalance to the Roman Curia.
Okay, hold on a sec. The Roman Curia, that's like the administrative body of the church, right? What about these bishops' conferences, and why are they suddenly shaking things up?
It's like this. Before Vatican II, councils were mostly driven by Rome. Now you have these national conferences representing bishops from entire countries, advocating for their own agendas. And the book points out the French bishops specifically, known for their progressive stances. They were a big force in this shift. They were the biggest group there after the Italians and Americans, so they had a lot of influence.
So it's not just theological debates, but power struggles too. And if I'm following you correctly, this rise of bishops' conferences, this is a huge change from how things worked before, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a decentralization of power, giving more of a voice to the bishops. Whether that was a good thing in the end, that's still up for debate. It definitely added to that sense of things fragmenting and made it harder to interpret what the council actually decided.
It's like the council unintentionally created this power vacuum, and different groups within the church rushed in to fill it with their own ideas about the future.
You got it. And that's exactly what happens. In the middle of this decentralization, you have the Coitus Internationalis Patrum forming during the council. This is a group of conservative bishops pushing back against what they saw as a progressive wave.
The coitus. Tell me more about that. What were they most worried about?
Well, the Coitus represented a bunch of bishops who felt like the council was moving too fast and going too far. They were worried about preserving core doctrines, keeping the traditional liturgy, and resisting what they saw as bending over backwards to accommodate secular trends. Archbishop Lefebvre, who later broke away from Rome, was a key figure in that group.
So even while the council was happening, you had this clear tension between those who wanted to embrace change and those who wanted to hold on to tradition.
Exactly. And this tension becomes even more obvious in the years after the council. Specific things like the liturgy, ecumenism, and religious liberty, those became flashpoints for these deeper disagreements.
We're about out of time for part one, but before we go, can you give us a little preview of what those flashpoints were all about? I'm especially interested in the liturgy debates. De Mattei is a big fan of Latin, isn't he?
Yeah, the liturgy was a major battleground. De Mattei really makes a case for Latin's universality, its ability to unite the church across cultures and time. He even quotes a 1961 article from L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper.
What's so special about that article?
That article makes a really compelling argument for Latin as this unifying force. It allowed priests from all over the world to understand papal documents and say Mass anywhere, regardless of the local language. It's interesting because it was published during John the 23rd's time as Pope.
So even as things were changing, people still saw the value of Latin.
Exactly. It shows how these weren't simple issues. Even those open to reforming the liturgy saw something special in Latin.
De Mattei paints this beautiful picture of Latin uniting the church across cultures and through history. But to be honest, for those of us who don't speak Latin, Mass could feel pretty hard to follow. I get why people wanted to hear the liturgy in their own language.
That's the core of the issue, right? How do you make the liturgy both understandable for people and at the same time maintain that sense of universality, that link to the church's ancient roots?
It's like trying to do two things at once.
It was. And as De Mattei points out, the results of those liturgical reforms were kind of mixed.
Okay, let's move on to another big one. Ecumenism. De Mattei hints at some serious stuff going on behind the scenes around this, especially with Cardinal B. He was a big supporter of talking to other Christian denominations.
It's interesting that ecumenism became this lens through which a lot of the council's debates were seen, wanting more unity with Protestants influenced how they wrote the documents and even shaped their theological arguments.
De Mattei seems to suggest that this focus on ecumenism sometimes led to compromises on Catholic teaching, or using vague language that caused confusion later on.
That's an important point, and it's still discussed today. How do you have these discussions with other Christians without watering down what makes Catholicism unique? It's a tough balance.
And finally, we get to what might be the biggest flashpoint of all religious liberty. De Mattei describes how Pope Paul VI, who took over after John the 23rd died, really pushed for a strong statement on this, even though it made some people unhappy.
That debate was so heated because it got to the heart of how the church and the state relate to each other. For centuries, the church had often been closely tied to political powers. Sometimes it even actively tried to suppress other religions.
So this idea of religious liberty, that everyone has the right to choose their own faith, that was a huge change.
Absolutely. The Council's declaration on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, was a turning point. It said that every person has this inherent dignity to follow their conscience when it comes to faith.
But De Mattei suggests that some bishops saw this as a dangerous step towards secularism, a move away from the church's traditional authority.
Right. Dignitatis Humanae is still controversial today. Some argue it opened the door to relativism, making it harder for the church to speak with authority about what's true. Others see it as a necessary development, acknowledging human dignity and freedom of conscience.
Wow, so these three issues, the liturgy, ecumenism, and religious liberty, they were like earthquakes shaking the church's foundation.
Exactly. And these tremors didn't stop when the council ended in 1965. They kept going, shaping the years after the council and contributing to the very crisis that Paul VI himself talked about.
And that's where we'll pick things up in part two. It sounds like the aftermath of Vatican II was just as important as the council itself, maybe even more so. I can't wait to explore those consequences with you next time. Don't go anywhere. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into, well, everything after Vatican II. Last time we were talking about Roberto de Mattei's book and how he sees this period. Things were getting pretty intense, right? Remember those like flashpoints we talked about? The liturgy, ecumenism, religious liberty. Well, let's jump into those head first now.
Yeah, these weren't just like polite discussion topics, you know. They were where those big tensions we were talking about really, really played out. For real.
Let's start with the liturgy then. De Mattei, he really goes to bat for Latin.
Hmm.
He argues that it wasn't just about, hanging on to tradition for tradition's sake. It was about keeping the church unified. He even quotes this 1961 article from L'Osservatore Romano, that's the Vatican's newspaper. What's so important about that article?
Well, it lays out this really strong case for Latin as, like, this force that brings everyone together. You know, priests from all over the world could understand papal documents. They could celebrate Mass anywhere, no matter what the local language was. And it's especially interesting because it came out during John the 23rd's papacy.
So even with all this talk of change, people still recognized how important Latin was.
Exactly. It shows you these weren't just black and white issues. Even those who were open to changing the liturgy, they saw that Latin had something unique to offer.
De Mattei makes Latin sound so beautiful, uniting the church across different cultures and through time. But honestly, if you don't actually speak Latin, Mass could feel pretty, I don't know, closed off. I can see why some people wanted to hear it in their own language.
That's the big problem, isn't it? How do you make the liturgy something everyday people can understand and at the same time keep that sense of universality, that connection to the church's ancient roots?
Sounds like an impossible task, to be honest.
It was tough, and like de Mattei points out, the changes they made to the liturgy, well, they had mixed results.
Okay, on to the next hot-button issue, ecumenism. De Mattei hints at a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering around this one, especially with Cardinal B. He was really into dialogue with other Christian groups.
The interesting thing is how ecumenism kind of became this lens that people saw a lot of the council's debates through. Like this desire to be closer to Protestants, for example, it influenced how they worded the documents and even how they made their theological arguments.
De Mattei seems to suggest that this whole ecumenical focus sometimes meant that they compromised on Catholic doctrine, or that they used language that was so vague it just caused more confusion later on.
Yeah, that's a key point. And people are still talking about it today. How do you engage in this dialogue with other Christians, but without, watering down what makes Catholicism, well, Catholic? It's like walking a tightrope.
And now we come to, I think, the biggest flashpoint of them all, religious liberty. De Mattei describes how Pope Paul VI, who took over after John 63rd died, really pushed for a strong statement on this, even though some people weren't happy about it at all.
That debate got so heated because it went right to the core of, like, the relationship between the church and the state. For centuries, the church had been super close to political powers. Sometimes it even actively went after other religions.
So this idea of religious liberty, that everyone has the right to choose their faith, that was a radical shift.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, that was a total turning point. It said every person has this inherent dignity to follow their own conscience when it comes to faith.
But de Mattei suggests that some bishops saw this as like a slippery slope to secularism, like moving away from the church's traditional authority.
That's right. Dignitatis Humanae is still causing controversy. Some people say it opened the door to moral relativism, like weakening the church's ability to say definitively what's true. Others see it as something that just had to happen, a recognition of human dignity and that freedom of conscience thing we were talking about.
Man, so these three issues, liturgy, ecumenism, religious liberty, there was like major earthquakes shaking things up in the church.
Yeah, you could say that. And they didn't stop when the council was over in 1965 either. They kept going, shaping the years that followed and contributing to this whole crisis that Paul VI himself talked about.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 3. It's amazing to think that the stuff that happened after Vatican II might have been even more important than the council itself. I can't wait to dig into those consequences with you next time. You won't want to miss it. Okay, so we're back. Still deep diving into, like, the whole world after Vatican II. We've been walking through Roberto de Mattei's book, and, man, things are complicated. We saw how the council really set off these huge debates about where the church was headed. So now let's get into what actually happened in the years after, right?
Yeah, it's like watching this earthquake in slow motion. The council, that was just the first tremor. The real impact was all the aftershocks, the way it, like, totally changed the church's landscape.
De Mattei really paints this picture of a church in crisis. He
Yeah.
talks about dissent, about how the numbers of priests and nuns were dropping, and just this overall feeling that no one really knew what Catholicism meant anymore.
Right, and he gives some really specific examples that show this crisis playing out. One of the big ones is the pushback against Humanae Vitae. That's Pope Paul VI's encyclical that reaffirmed the church's teaching about artificial contraception.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge deal. I remember reading about how some theologians were actually telling people to disobey the Pope. That's almost unheard of, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a huge break from how things were before the council. All of a sudden, you have theologians publicly disagreeing, bishops' conferences putting out statements that went against Rome, and this growing idea that individual conscience is more important than the church's teaching, like a real earthquake when it comes to authority.
De Mattei seems to think that even though the council was supposed to open up dialogue, it might have accidentally opened the door to all kinds of theological chaos. He mentions guys like Karl Rahner and Hans Kung who were pushing for a more, I guess you could say, modern take on Catholicism.
Those theologians and others like Yves Conger, they were super influential after the council. They questioned how people traditionally understood doctrine and said historical context was really important. And they pushed for this more dialogical approach to theology.
Dialogical, huh? What does that even mean?
Well, instead of the church just like proclaiming truths from above, they said it should be more of a two-way conversation with the modern world. Like really listen to its questions and take its ideas seriously.
So less one-sided teaching and more back and forth. That's interesting. But I can see how that could also lead to a lot more disagreement.
Exactly. Some people found their ideas exciting, but they were also super controversial. They definitely contributed to that feeling of like things breaking apart and uncertainty that de Mattei talks about.
And remember how we were talking about episcopal conferences, those national groups of bishops? De Mattei thinks they played a part of this post-council turmoil, too.
Yeah, he argues that those conferences, especially the ones in Central Europe, they became these hubs for new theological ideas, often pushing the limits of what Rome was okay with. This whole decentralization thing, even though it was supposed to give bishops more say, it had some unintended consequences, too.
So instead of one unified church, you start to see different regions going their own ways.
Yeah, exactly. Like all these different interpretations were pulling the church in different directions. And right in the middle of all this change, you have groups like the Codex Internationalis Patrum forming. Those conservative bishops we talked about, they were trying so hard to hold on to the traditional teachings and practices.
It's like they were trying to anchor themselves in the middle of a storm.
Exactly. And even though they couldn't stop all the changes, their resistance shows you just how deep the divisions within the church were.
So if we're taking De Mattei at his word, things sound pretty bad, right? It's
Yeah.
like instead of leading to this renewal, the council actually threw the church into an identity crisis. Is that a fair assessment? Or is he maybe being a little over the top?
I think it's important to remember that de Mattei is coming from a specific perspective. He's highlighting the negative stuff that happened after the council, but other scholars focus on the things it achieved, like how it opened up to the modern world, how it emphasized the role of lay people, and its call for renewal.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Definitely not. But even those who really celebrate the council's legacy will admit that it was a wild time, a time of huge change and upheaval.
So what does it all mean then? What are we supposed to take away from this?
Well, de Mattei leaves us with some tough questions, like how do you balance tradition and change in something as old and complicated as the Catholic Church? And where do you draw the line between what an individual believes and what the church teaches?
Yeah, those are some big questions. Questions that probably don't have easy answers.
That's for sure. I think that's the whole point of a deep dive like this. It's not about finding simple answers. It's about wrestling with these really complex questions. Vatican II was a huge turning point, a time when the church was trying to figure out how to navigate a world that was changing so fast.
And it's obvious that the effects of all that are still being felt today. Makes you wonder, did the council actually make the church stronger, or did it make it more vulnerable?
That's a question we all have to think about, I guess. What's clear is that the years after Vatican II weren't easy. It was a time of intense debates, a lot of experimenting, and a lot of soul-searching.
Well, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener, that's for sure. It's given me a totally new way of looking at the Church, Vatican II, and all the things that still shape Catholicism today. Thanks so much for taking us on this journey.
It's been my pleasure. The journey of faith, as we've seen, it's rarely a straight line. It's full of twists and turns, moments when things are clear and moments when you're questioning everything. And maybe that's what makes it so fascinating.
And on that thought-provoking note, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the aftermath of Vatican II. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little challenging. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.